This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. I'm speaking with Marcy Bowers. She's a doctor who's an expert in transgenderism and gender dysphoria, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Marcy Bowers is a doctor who specializes in gender and sexual issues, and I'm going to be talking with her about the issue of gender dysphoria or transgenderism. So before I do, though, Marcy, if you could give me a little background about yourself, what drew you to, I guess you're listed as a gynecologist, so what drew you to particularly gender issues?
Well, yes, as you state, I was trained as an OBGYN specialist, and I actually delivered babies for about 20 years. So, but during that time, I met a man named Stanley Biber. Now, he was an interesting character. He was a rancher, and his parents actually wanted him to be a rabbi or a piano teacher. And he wanted to be a rancher and a surgeon, and of course he went out and became a surgeon and a rancher, and so he practiced general surgery in a small town in southern Colorado. And I met him in the year 2000 when he was 78 years old, and he at the time was still performing transgender surgery. And he, in fact, is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as having done the most ever of these operations, at one point having done nearly 2/3 of the world's operations. So he was an extraordinary man, and I met him, fortunately. He planted a seed, you might say, and I was mid-career a couple years later, and I thought to myself, well, why not? There's no one coming up. He was one of the only ones performing this procedure worldwide, and how he became so much of a lone pariah is he is the university programs that flourished in the 1960s and 70s shut down after Johns Hopkins published a paper in 1971 stating that transgender people were no better after surgery than they were before, or after surgery and hormones than they were before. In fact, they were unhappy, which was not supported by the data, but nonetheless, and it's been refuted many times, but nonetheless, that persisted, and so it was taken as a flashpoint for university programs to close their doors, and so that left just a few people around, Dr. Schneider being one of them, still doing the operations. And of course, the problem being part of the notion of not having your genitals match your gender identity, a condition known as gender dysphoria, that problem persisted. And it's a global problem. So it happens in every socioeconomic level, in every geographical area, in every religious community. I mean, it doesn't matter where your origins are. There's still a baseline level of this feeling, and so surgery and hormones do make a person better, does allow them to live their lives fully, and so anyway, he became very well known, particularly through the 70s and 80s, and in 2003, I left my OBGYN practice in Seattle, and I made the trek out there with my son and my boyfriend, and we picked up history where the history baton was handed off.
Well, just so people know, I'll link to marcybowers.com, your website, below this video, so people can look at it after they watch this. But let me just get some terms straightened out, because I know, I believe the first, what was called transsexual operation occurred, in the early 50s. And for decades, it was known as transsexualism. Now it's called transgenderism. But it seems that transsexualism or transsexual is a more specific term, whereas a transgender can be someone who has had an operation or not, whereas a transsexual is someone who went male to female or female to male. Why has transsexual gone out of use in favor of transgender?
Well, let's just correct a couple things, just historical notes. One is that this notion of being, wrongly gendered. In other words, your internal sense of maleness and femaleness, your gender identity, the idea that it doesn't match your genitals. This is not something new, and in fact, you can look throughout. Even in the Bible, there are 50 some references to eunuchs, which were castrated males, willingly castrated, which allows, when you're castrated, of course, it feminizes the face and body. And indeed, these individuals were quite prominent and quite well accepted. The Bible, as also know, doesn't speak out against anything like changing sex. It really doesn't mention that at all. And if you look around in biology, biologically, it makes no sense that a single measure is afforded only two choices. Anything biologically measured, like gender or gender identity, to have only two choices, it's really inconsistent with how nature is organized.
Well,
so, go ahead.
Well, let me just ask you about that. But I mean, generally speaking, creatures, at least, well, even plants, are generally considered male or female, and sometimes, I guess you would say, intersex, someone born with both sets of genitalia. So what do you mean by, well, what do you mean by the difference between gender? Because some people I've read, claim there's 70 plus genders. I mean, that seems a little ridiculous. I mean, to have 70 plus genders.
Well, not if you look at it as a continuum. And we know even in the formation of genitals, that isn't necessarily one or the other. And many plant and animal kingdoms can switch sexes willingly. So there are clearly places in between that are not necessarily defined. They don't have a word for it. And that's the formation of genitals. So in the brain, which is infinitely more complex, the idea of one's maleness and femaleness, it really is not. It's not really a revolution to think that there might be a continuum between male and female.
But so you're saying that gender is detached from sexual organs, then? Because you would say if you have a penis and testicles, sexually you're a male. If you have a vagina, a clitoris, sexually you're a female. So gender is to be detached from sexual appearance, then, or sexual content, if you will.
That's absolutely right.
Okay. So yeah, then what? Absolutely. Then what?
However,
okay.
Again, even where the genitals are concerned, there is a spectrum. There is a diversity of formation. So it isn't black and white like we always have thought. In fact, a fairly high percentage of newborns are born with what we would used to call ambiguous genitalia, or now we would call them an intersex state, or yes.
And what percentage of people is that? Is that like a tenth of a percent? Or?
1 in 2,000. 1 in 2,000.
1 in 2,000, okay.
Births have an intersex condition.
So if gender is disassociated in a sense from sexuality, I guess, or a sexual appearance, what then is it then? Is this then more a psychological state then? Is this in the brain then?
No, I think what it is, it's a reordering of how we look at gender and gender identity. It was, if you think about how life progresses, we take birth sex, so that your genitals at birth, however imperfect they may be, and we assign male or female. And of course, with each choice being only two choices, there is a wide range or a very differing set of gender expectations, gender roles, and pathways that people are pushed along. Well, and it doesn't ever address what their sense of gender identity is. In other words, after birth, children know their sense of maleness and femaleness by 4, 5, 6 years old. Yeah. They're very well aware of how they feel in terms of their gender identity.
But you said that you delivered babies. So if you had gotten a child that has a penis and testicles, I mean, isn't it asking a little bit much of doctors to have a newborn who has and say, well, that's got male sexuality, but it might grow up to be whatever gender. I mean, the doctor is just writing M and F because
that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's what we're. It's a real paradigm shift in our mind. Is that when we say, instead of saying we've got a healthy child with an appendage that appears to be a penis or a very large clitoris, we, that. In other words, assigning gender to those set of genitals is not necessarily appropriate.
So let me just ask then, if we're talking something that people can choose, would it be better instead of, because oftentimes gender, as currently modernly defined here in the early 21st century, is looked at to a degree the way race or ethnicity is. Would it be better to look at it the way people look at religion, i.e., I might have been born a Lutheran, like I was, but I'm an atheist agnostic now, but I could convert to become a Jew or a Muslim or a Sikh. So are we talking gender is more along the lines of religion and what one chooses to be versus their ethnicity? If to use it.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Right. I mean, if you're born African, you cannot make yourself Caucasian, or if you're born a Spaniard, you cannot make yourself, a Middle Eastern, even if you will yourself to be. But yet, in your personal philosophy, you can make changes. But I think I would argue that gender identity is much more core to that. In other words, gender identity is much more along the line of race and ethnicity, and then that is simply how you are.
Uh-huh. Well, that brings up the case. Like a year or two ago, there was the famous case of the white woman who was posing as a black woman who was head of a local NAACP. I think it was up in like Portland or Seattle, someplace, and she was roundly ridiculed and accused of trying to usurp blackness or whatnot.
Sure.
But why is her identifying with, say, African Americans or Africanness, if you will, how is that any different than, say, someone who is born with male genitalia who wants to be, number 31 out of however many genders you want to assign?
Well, we're kind of swirling down the esoteric kind of points about this, but I don't know fully the details of that African case, but I don't think she was trying to. I don't think it was a matter of misrepresentation. I think she had a genuine passion for representing the African American community, and why she was vilified. I don't know the details, but I would say that she was treated unfairly. Mm-hmm. But that's really a different sort of situation. That's partly political, that's partly social, and then backing up against racist issues and racial backlash for how, imagine a black person trying to act white or something. What's the big deal? I just don't understand that. But the same thing with gender identity. If a person is feeling themselves to be more feminine, that should be something that is, as we pursue life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that should be something that a person is able to do and express in any way, in the way that they see appropriate.
Well, let me go to the acronym. The acronym in recent decades that has been the most in, say, non-heterosexual realm is LGBT, and then you get Q, I, A, and all these other things. That's something different though from gender? That because you would be lesbian, queer, bisexual, gay, transsexual, transgender, intersex, questioning, asexual, and so that though is not gender, is it?
No, generally that's referring to sexuality, but the T in LGBT includes transgender. Now, you mentioned a couple terms, transsexual and transgender. I don't think it's an important distinction, but you're right. Transgender is more of an inclusive term, just like I think the LGBTQIRS, etc. The point is that it's meant to be inclusive, and I think the more that we open our arms to the fact that we're in some way, each of us is a minority, and if you realize that each of your own individual issues have commonality in the struggle that each faces, then that is a healthy way to look forward at the world and to say that, you know, we're all fighting the same force of dividing us and making us different.
Well, to give you the case of Bruce / Caitlyn Jenner, that the thing that's interesting there is, I would think that if this was the 1950s or 60s, he would be considered a transvestite, because he has stated that he considers himself a woman, but as far as I know, he's not undergone any transsexual or gender where he was.
No, that's not true. That's not true. And I would call her, I would say that's her gender identity, and so I would refer to her as she, and that's the only way I'll refer to her, because that's her gender identity. She identifies as she. She's had surgery. She's been on hormones. She looks good. That book is closed as far as I'm concerned.
So she is a transsexual now that you know of? I mean,
she's a woman.
I know, but has she had surgery? You said she had surgery. I know.
No, that's public information. I don't normally disclose public information or medical information, but that is public information. Yes, in fact, she's written that in her book.
Okay.
And she's called me personally to. Yeah, I'm well aware of her.
So where then do you see? Because we're recording now in early 2018, and it was just about 2 years ago. It was in late 2016 that the gay marriage rights came along. How does gender issues parallel or separate from, say, purely gay issues? Because I know when I was growing up, there was often a lot of tension between lesbians and gay males, and there still is to certain degrees. That some people prefer to use a term like queer versus gay because they feel it's more politically relevant or aggressive or whatnot. Are these issues parallel issues, or do they mix, or can they be separated?
Well, there are parallels in the struggle, and this is why I mentioned anyone in a minority sphere, and whether it's racial, religious, sexual, or gender identity differences, then in each of those groups they fight obstacles that if we lock arms and we have empathy for the struggles that the other groups are going through, then we are stronger as a whole.
So what? Let me just go back to the term of gender dysphoria, because that sounds like a medicalized term. Is that the preferred term, or is transgenderism the preferred term, and why?
Gender dysphoria is the feeling of being uncomfortable in your assigned gender, birth gender. And in other words, you have dysphoria or discomfort with the fact that your genitalia does not match your gender identity.
Uh-huh. So is that considered now? So in this day and age, is that, or with you, is that considered a medical condition, or what then, or is it a psychological condition?
Yeah, it's a medical. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. I would call it a medical condition. I don't. I mean, that's what it's. That's the diagnostic term we use to allow people to proceed with surgery and hormones. And it's clear that it's established at a very early age. The sense of dysphoria with one's genitals is or with one's birth assignment, or gender assignment, that is established at a very early age. And it's also very immutable. It's very difficult to suppress it or to make it go away. Whether you try therapy, hormones, religious, you can throw the book at whatever you try, it's simply not something that goes away.
Well,
so I would define that as a medical condition.
Yeah. Well,
the problem is that it does not have a single diagnostic test or litmus test to be able to say. But there are some very good tests. We see kids We know that 90% of the patients that undergo surgery have had some degree of gender dysphoria by a very early age, or at least feelings of not being properly gendered in their birth assignment.
And for the last decade or so, since we've so-called cracked the human genome, do we have any idea that this might be genetically based, i.e. that it could be passed along, say, a recessive gene on the mother's side or the father's side, or?
No, but of course not. But it's like many medical conditions. It's what we call multifactorial, which have a lot of we're seeing it on the rise recently because it's become a little less socially stigmatized. It's become easier for a person to come out as transgender. Again, transgender is that loose. Just to finish the question that I didn't answer, but the transgender is more of the umbrella term, and again, it's more inclusive, and it does include people who do not necessarily wish to change their genitals. Now, it's just that uncomfortable. Their gender presentation does not match their birth assignment.
So when you say multifactorial, does that include nurture as well as nature?
Of course, absolutely. All of those things factor in. Hormonal environment and maternal hormonal environment. There are environmental factors. We know that there are biologically active substances in our food and water, and those can have some role. But you cannot underestimate the power of simply the mind and how it's organized. And the sense of maleness and femaleness is very strong among species. Yeah, so that really trumps, not to use that term, but trumps everything. It really takes precedent. And so this is really the changing paradigm, is that we realize that gender identity is much stronger than even the forces of nature that create genitals.
So when you say that it could include things like a diet or whatnot, we've come in the last 20-some years, fetal alcohol syndrome. Would there be a thing that you would say to a pregnant woman that, do you foresee, say, in 10 years, people would say, well, if you have a high lipid diet or low carb diet or something, this may affect something. So if the mother wants to have, say, a very macho kind of kid.
You seem to be medicalizing transgenderism as though it's something bad.
I'm asking because you brought up the multifactorial and the diet and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Well, then if you're going to propose some sort of alternative to escape it, then you would say that you would term it as perhaps something that is a negative force that we're trying to avoid. That you can offer counsel for a pregnant mother to avoid the situation.
Well, the reason I ask is because when you're talking it's multifactorial. For example, we are getting to the age now where we're probably in 10 or 20 years, we're going to have nanobots that will be able to be shot in. So let's say if you have a family condition of, I don't know, some genetic disease, you could maybe go in and have these little nanobots, even in the fetus perhaps in 20 or 30 years, redo something. So my point is, if we come to a point that someone in 20 years publishes a landmark work that says A, B, and C, this is what happens in the mind of someone, there would be a political backlash if someone suggested that we should send in nanobots into a fetus because the mother wants to have a very feminine girl or a very virile, macho, jock boy. And so do you foresee that at some level? And would that individual, that woman, say, who is in control of her body, I support abortion, would she then have the right to do that if she so wanted to and had that information, just like the genetic history of any family, sickle cell anemia or something?
Well, again, the supposition is that the rigid binary of having the macho man and the feminine girl is the ideal of society. And I would just like, Donald Trump would just prefer to have the U.S. populated with Norwegians. The fact is that diversity is the force that is probably the strongest force for good and for unity in the world. That means we embrace all customs, we embrace all religions, we we embrace all genders, and we embrace all soul differences.
Yeah, well, I'm not arguing that. I'm just
gender identities. That means that you just simply say to yourself, what we should be doing is not saying, well, here's the way you get an ideal macho man. Everybody wants everybody wants their son to be an All-American football player. Let's face it, if everybody had All-American football players, there'd be nobody in the stands watching.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, but my point is, though, that people, it comes to like a civil rights. For example, I did a show a few months ago about polygamy and the civil rights issues of people who want to be polygamous, especially with gay marriage. And so my point is, though, we can always say, well, we want this or that political eventuality because it agrees with our views. My point is, there will always be someone, especially if it's a pregnant woman, and maybe at some point in 20 or 30 years, women will be relieved of pregnancy. We'll have artificial wombs. But what does the individual, the male or the female, if they choose to, for example, they want a brown-haired kid with X, there is going to come a point at some time later this century where people will probably have the ability to choose features beyond sexuality. If they want a kid that does this, that, or the other thing. And I'm just wondering how that politically would square with the idea of sexuality. And
sexuality, I don't know. That's one. Sexuality is one thing. I don't know that you can tell that
the
by
gender issues,
genetics, or any pre-planning what the kid's sexuality is going to be like. But if with my experience with transgender is that since it's such an affirmative, such an amazing process, such an empowering sort of thing, I would think every parent would want their kid to be transgender. So there's going to be what happens then? What if everybody wants their kid to be transgender because they realize that kid's got superpowers?
Well, so you think that then there's really never going to be, in other words, like there's the old saying, many roads to nirvana, or many paths to nirvana, that there are many different ways that someone would have become transgender. That's what your claim would be, that there's not just one lock and one key that someone is going to be genetically open.
Well, that's right. I mean, you have genetics, you have bodies, you have life, you have hormones, you have society, and you have rules, and yet, and then you get this complex interplay with the human brain, and the brain does what it wants to do. People love who they want to love. You can't explain everything in life. You have to just embrace it. And I think what it really does invoke is the other thing that unifies religions, and that is love. And if you look and you really do believe in a higher power, then I think what you have to do is you have to be open, not closed. Many religions have closed their doors to other people. They need to be open, and that means open love, open arms, open border, open acceptance.
Well, I mean, religion, I think, is how many thousands of years we still have religions at each other's throats. So I don't.
It's a global problem, but there is a unifying theme amongst religions. There is supposed to be one anyway, and that is love.
So let me just go back in history a little bit then. You had the Stonewall movement for gay rights in the late 60s that started out. You had figures, I forget who was the first person in the 50s that had the transsexual operation.
Actually, Lily Elby is purported to have been the first surgical process performed. That operation was done in 1933 in Dresden, Germany.
Oh, really?
And so that the movie The Danish Girl highlighted her struggle, and of course that surgery ended eventually in her demise.
Yeah.
So she did not. It's a very dangerous operation.
Oh, okay. When you said so, it was surgical. I was thinking that's the end of the Weimar Republic, beginning of the Nazis. She wasn't killed in a death camp, was she?
No. She had surgery. Actually, 31, 33. I don't know. Anyway.
And then probably in America, the most famous case in the late 70s was Renee Richards, the former.
She was 1956.
Renee Richards? No, wasn't that the 70s?
No. She challenged the USTA in the 1970s. If you recall,
Yeah, as a pro player.
A mid-level male tennis player.
Yeah.
And she sued to allow herself to compete with the women on the women's circuit, with a lot of resistance from other women. And of course she won her case, and but the fear was that she would have this dominant male body. Well, the fact is, after hormones and surgeries, her musculature devolved down to the level of just something of a similar aged woman, and so indeed she was a mid-level female tennis player. So nothing very. She didn't dominate all the circuits. She didn't win every tournament. She played about like she did in the men's circuit.
But I know in the last year or two, I remember there was a young teenage girl who was born a boy, and she won some tournament or something, and
kickboxing, yeah. Fallon Fox.
Yeah.
And she's interesting, but again, these sports generally, it's not a matter of strength; it's a matter of conditioning. And I haven't heard much from Fallon lately, but people finally realize that really she just keeps herself in incredibly good shape, and she had incredibly good technique, and that was why she dominated, not because she used to be a male.
Let me just talk about the differences of going male to female or female to male. I know back 20, 30 years ago, there was often a group of politically active lesbians who often rejected the gay male ideal that they were born that way. There was the idea that they chose that to stand up against the patriarchy or whatnot. Is there any particular difference that you have seen between male to female or female to male in terms of how they came to that place, or in the way they react to the surgeries, or if they don't have surgery?
Well, I just to get back on the politicalness of the LGBT community, is that in recent years people have stood together. So in other words, gays, lesbians, transgender, bisexual people have locked arms, realizing that the struggles of each minority group are similar to one another, and that the force they're facing is a larger force. So coming to understand, not that men, often it's difficult. I'm astounded by the lack of information that the lesbian and gay communities sometimes have about transgender, and vice versa. So that continues to be a struggle, that not knowing the issues that each face. But the fact is that we're much more allied in realizing that our struggles are similar. And that's why I think it's to open it up, to actually make it even more inclusive. And I love the symbol and, or the ampersand, the symbol, the inclusive symbol, meaning everyone in some ways involved. So racial minorities also face similar forces.
But is there any kind of particular difference that you've noticed, either in your practice or in general reading the literature, between male to female or female to male, whether it's surgery or not? I mean, in terms of psychological outcomes, you mentioned earlier a happiness study, I believe.
Yeah, no, people are much happier being who they are. When you have a tiny kid who's obviously very, very feminine, and that's the way they're born, and then they're allowed to live that way, they're a happier people. They are a happy person, and you only need to ask as far as the parents of those kids. They really come out of their shells.
So where do you see the immediate future of the next 10 or 20 years? Do you think that the issues are more political now, or are they going to be more science-based? In other words, is there some kind of, I'd mentioned earlier, like nanobots, do you think that there will be a point where, because a lot of transgender people will be taking estrogen or testosterone shots, will there come a point where there'll be a technology where that won't be, that people won't have to be taking these supplements, I guess you'd call them?
Sure. I think I mean, maybe surgery won't be necessary when people realize that you can still be a woman in society even though you have a penis, or you can still be a male in society even though you have a vagina. It doesn't really matter. That doesn't change the gender identity. Gender identity is who you are. But there may be more acceptance of having people whose body parts are more, they're more like a la carte items, and that they're more, have, that a man with breasts, that's not unusual, or, a woman with a penis, that's just not, maybe those are going to be more acceptable someday.
Let me just talk about another parallel between transgenderism and gay or non-hetero sexuality. And oftentimes I've seen this, people talk about a sliding scale, and sometimes, for example, bisexuals are sometimes mocked by homosexuals as not making up their mind too. Is there such a thing as a sliding scale, i.e. someone at the age of 15 in their teens may have been born female, thinks they're male, and then by the time they're 30-ish, they slide backwards along the scale in the sense that they now identify more with the female. I've seen this, for example, with people who say they went through a lesbian phase. I've known a number of women who went through a lesbian phase in their college years, and then by the time they hit 30, they become, a soccer mom. Is there a similar thing, a phenomenon?
I think you could argue pretty clearly that that's a lot different. That gender identity is a lot different than sexual preference.
So again, people don't slide that way then?
Not nearly as much. I mean, the incidence of regret in my practice is extremely small. I mean, I know I can think of 3 people who have ever in some way gone back, and 2 of them did so because they could not establish long-term intimate relationships in their new gender, and the other went back because they could not establish they couldn't keep employment in their preferred gender. Well, so they went back for social reasons.
I wasn't talking about regret, though.
It changed their gender identity. So that gender identity thing, once it's stuck, I mean, this is the thing. Once people actually when they go through the process, which is extremely laborious, extremely painful, and extremely expensive, when they go all the way through that journey, the chances of them going back are no more than a snowball in. And they have no more chance than a snowball in the Congo. It ain't going to happen.
Well, you just mentioned expenses. What is the current state of medical insurance regarding these issues?
20 states now mandate coverage for transgender persons and employees in employers with more than 100 employees, and something like that. I don't know the exact stats on that, but I believe it's about 20 states, but that still leaves about 80% of the country without insurance coverage. So it's still a problem. And of course, these surgeries get into the tens of thousands of dollars. Even if a person goes over to Thailand now, they're upwards of close to $20,000 US.
Why would someone have to go to a different country?
Because of the cost. The cost structure here in the U.S. costs in hospital settings are very expensive. And it's just simply a state of fact about the way things are structured here in the U.S.
So you mentioned Thailand, and Bangkok is famously sexually free and whatnot. Is there what cultures around?
Actually, just to correct that, it's actually not. Transgender patients there also face a lot of discrimination. So people see it as being this, mecca of. There is somewhat of a difference in how they approach gender identity, though, and that's interesting. And that what happens is, as kids are young, if they express, let's say, just take boys, if they express some feminine feelings, they aren't, let's say, bullied and shamed like we sometimes do to our feminine children here in this country. So, in other words, they're sort of allowed to be socially to be, girl boy type thing. That's a difference.
Okay, what cultures then around the world then are more open? For example, Latin American cultures, on one hand, are famously machismo based, but by the same token, if you go to Brazil, they seem to be a lot more sexually open in some ways. Is there certain types of cultures that are more attuned to this idea of gender identity than say the U.S. is or the Western Europe?
Well, historically, there have been Indian culture. It's cultural, so and there are certain cultures in certain regions around the world. The South Pacific, India has their Hijri. The Bardash were two-spirit persons in Indian cultures of the 19th century. They've been known eunuchs of the biblical age. These are all early representations of transgender persons. So, looking around the world globally now, there isn't any one culture that necessarily embraces things, but certainly there's become a great deal more tolerance for alternative gender expressions.
Uh-huh.
In other words, for some loosening of our very strict gender roles.
Uh-huh.
You have to look. I think what you have to look at is evolutionarily how we are evolving, and the fact is that it's really very artificial that we have separated sexes as much as we have sociologically. In other words, in our own DNA, you mentioned DNA before. Males and females share 99.7% of our own DNA. So we have that in common from the get-go. And that percentage is actually a lot higher than it is for many animal species. And, of course, but looking at it sociologically, when you look back in to the early 20th century, the world was a much larger place, and people discovered this nation of you mentioned Thailand. It was then known as Siam, and when this is why this looseness or this openness of having alternative genders is probably a little more accepted there, and that is when Westerners came to Thailand, when they came to Siam, they noted that the women were very unattractive. They stated very unattractive, and the reason they stated was that when they looked around, is that the boys and the girls shared similar haircuts, similar clothing. They had there were just no makeup, no jewelry, so they were very, very similarly dressed. And so what Westerners quickly was, you need to grow your hair long. You're a girl. You need to be short if you're a boy. They separated the sexes. They took gender roles and they separated them. Biologically, we're much more similar, but yet society takes the sexes and it puts them on polar opposites. And what we have not done very well in recent years, we're beginning now to close that gap. And we're beginning to see that really gender is just another aspect of diversity, and that this is a healthy thing. This is evolutionarily a good thing for the planet.
Just let me just follow up on the point with the Thai people. Though there's also the element of race there too, and famously Europeans, white Europeans. There's always the element of sexuality and race that we may not find racial features. Someone who's from Norway or from Belgium goes to the Far East. They may have their issues though that also not just gender but are based on race. Correct?
Oh, there's still certainly egoism in Europeans. I mean, we're living it today in the United States. The idea that someone from Norway is more attractive than someone from Kenya. That's simply not true. It's just a matter of experience and seeing what we tend to like things that are similar to ourselves. That's one immutable fact. And we tend to like people that look a little bit like us.
Yeah.
We like our children. We think our children are the most beautiful because they partly look like us.
So let me just start wrapping up this interview with a couple of final questions here. On a political scale, I mentioned Stonewall and I mentioned gay marriage, which was approved, I believe, in late 2016. So you have basically about a 45, 46-year timeline from the first cultural awareness of the political aspect of that till uh, getting the major thing that was on their horizon. I look at, for example, the ethnicity of blacks. Okay, you can go back hundreds of years. We had a black male president, but still cops will willingly shoot down a black person with little or no regard. Where do you place, say, transgenderism on a political spectrum? Is it more closely akin to, say, that Stonewall legalizing gay rights marriage spectrum? Are we just 10, 20 years from getting where transgender people would want to be?
Well, remember, Stonewall gets a lot of credit for being the linchpin that had to fall in order for the gay rights to emerge. And it was if you study history from that era, of course, you know that those were actually transgender persons fighting back against the police, throwing high heels as their weapons to defend their right to be in that space. So transgender persons have been around a long time. But in terms of linking it with race and the struggle that we have for racial equality, again, what it really is, it's a struggle for diversity and acceptance of diversity. White people are having a very difficult time accepting that this country is becoming like the rest of the world. They want it to be a white, little wholesome place like it was. But that is not good for the U.S. and it's not good for the world. We are the beacon for the world. We are the place that people should be welcoming, and we need to learn to live with one another. And the same with the gender identity. People need to recognize that we're stronger if we can express those aspects of maleness and femaleness within our souls.
So, do you think by the middle of this century, 2050-ish or so, that these gender issues will be gone? Is it just a matter of, like they say, the old guard has to die off, and then a newer generation is more accepting than, generally speaking?
Well, I think it's hopeful. It's a hopeful thing that people do eventually die. Yeah. I hate to say it. Yeah, and these attitudes have to die off, but yet, they have to be replaced by new ideas. And so it's the new ideas really that are taking shape, that continue to change the world. But I think that it's very, very, Martin Luther King was quoted as saying, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends in the direction of justice."
Uh-huh.
And I love that quote because it's really true. If you're on the right side of history, you'll recognize that diversity is the force of good. That is the religious ideal that we're all after. That is the sign of hope. That's a sign of peace and prosperity. And it's why this country continues to lead the world. It can lead the world, maybe, but we're gonna do so in fits and starts, and we're gonna go different directions, and struggle with all these issues. But that's why it's also very important for each of us to stand up with individual liberty and to champion the idea of diversity.
Well, I guess my final question would be, going back to what I had earlier asked about, I guess, the scientific revolution. I had asked you about people having to take hormone injections and stuff for the rest of their life. Do you envision a time, some decades down the line, maybe by the middle of this century, where, for example, someone at the age of consent, and I'd assume, at the age of 18, if someone wanted, I would assume, well, let me just ask, is it the age of 18 the age where someone can consent to have transgender surgery, or?
They can have it by 17, the parent.
Oh, with a parent, okay. So,
but yeah.
Do you foresee then that there will be future technologies that will make it more easy to do so, and to the point that, not to say just putting on makeup or whatnot, but that it won't be a lifelong process where you'll have to be taking the things and it'll be a financial drain. What kind of technologies in the future will make this more easy? And I would think that the ease of it would also politically help the idea that, oh, it's not a big thing.
Well, hormones in surgery don't make the person, don't make the man or woman. I think that's one thing you have to uncouple from your brain. You know, if a woman doesn't take hormones after menopause, does she become a man? No. You know, she's still a woman. So it's not hormones or surgery that make the person. We've unfortunately seized on the idea of everything being about the genitals somehow, that because they're closed and they're elusive, people make assumptions about genitals every day. But if you pass someone in the street, it's very rare that you actually know what their genitals look like. If you think about that, I mean,
I generally don't pretend I have X-ray vision, you know. But
you make assumptions. Well, some people would love to have that, mostly men. But you make assumptions about one another's genitalia based on their gender expression. So based on how they conduct themselves, and you're doing so not because they're taking hormones, not because they've had surgery, but because societally they present in a feminine or a masculine way.
But isn't that also part of the evolutionary thing that human beings are wired for danger? For example, if we go back and it's 10,000 years ago and I see a member from another tribe, it's evolutionary favorable for me to be a bit wary because I know that 3 weeks ago that tribe had a war with our tribe. So we're talking about changing evolutionary traits that go across gender, sex, ethnicity, religion. I mean, human beings, we're generally speaking scared little creatures that are mostly scared of ourselves. I mean, we'd fear the saber-toothed tiger out there, but we were mostly warring against ourselves for the bulk of our history. So we're talking things that are wired deep into the human psyche, no?
You know, I think there's some aspect of that, but, you know, I think the planet is going to have to struggle with, you know, limited resources, limited water. You know, even transportation. You know, there's good evidence that we're changing our planet, the climate of our planet. You know, these are big issues that we're going to have to really work together with. And so we're going to have to really stop worrying so much about differences in skin color and religion and gender and start working together.
Well, MarcyBowers.com is Marcy's website. Anyone interested in contacting her or finding out more about her work can contact her there. Let me just ask you personally, though, final question. What is, you said that you had started out as an OBGYN. What are you currently doing? Are you doing more political activism, or do you still have an open office that, you know, you are taking patients and whatnot?
Oh, goodness. I do 150 male to female operations a year and about 20 or so female to male operations, plus countless other minor procedures that are similar to that. And we also, we're one of only a few places that work to restore the clitoris after female genital mutilation. So I was in Africa this year teaching clitoral restoration surgery to plastic surgeons in Nairobi, Kenya. We're going back this year to Nairobi, also Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and probably the Gambia later in the year as well.
Well, those are other issues that deserve their own shows, but I want to thank you for taking an hour or so to speak with me.
Thank you, Dan, very much. I enjoyed the time. Thank you.